a special education researcher with 10 years of experience in the field, ranging from classroom teaching, higher education, and technical assistance. Currently, Sacha is involved with special education teacher preparation and educational research at the University of Central Florida. She will be facilitating this research session on innovation meets practicality, increasing equity and inclusion across global contexts. A big welcome to Sacha Cartagena.
Hello, and thank you all so much for joining me on this presentation on innovation meets practicality, increasing equity and inclusion across global contexts. So as just mentioned, my name is Dr. Sacha Cartagena, and so just a recent update, I am actually now a special education researcher at the American Institutes for Research, so that's some very exciting news. Additionally, I serve on the board of directors for the Council for Exceptional Children, which is the largest professional organization within the United States that represents professionals working with students with disabilities. I am passionate about supporting educators and educational leaders who work with a diverse population of students, especially students with disabilities. Much of my work, like this presentation, is an integration of policy, research, and practice within the field of special needs education. So for today's presentation, here are our learner outcomes. As a result of this presentation, attendees will understand how inclusive dispositions and social models of disability help inform equitable decision-making and transformative pedagogies. We will learn frameworks and guiding questions which support technology implementation with a special emphasis of universal design for learning and the FAIR test. And additionally, we will be receiving a curated list of freely available resources to help you in your implementation of educational technology. So recognizing that I'm with you all for just a short period of time, this presentation will be a general overview of these different concepts. In reality, we know that systemic change in education does not result from one simple 30-minute presentation. Instead, it's a collective effort of intentional implementation and refinement. So with that said, my personal goal for you all today is to encourage you and to challenge you to make conscious efforts and consider equity and inclusion when selecting technology initiatives. So this conference is titled the International Conference on Transformative Education, of course. So in line with the conference theme, it is important to frame our discussion around transformative pedagogy. So with that said, here are some different international policies that are related to transformative pedagogy. And just so you are aware, when you see this icon in the corner, it just means that the resources that are listed on the slide are included as part of a resource list at the end of this presentation, and will also be formally shared through the conference organizers. And so with that said, I just wanted to highlight some of these important landmark international policies. And the first is the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs Education. And a quote from that is that schools have to find ways of successfully educating all children, including those who have serious disadvantages and disabilities. The Sustainable Development Goal 4, we know, states that we must ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And lastly, I wanted to highlight the Transformative Pedagogy for Peace Building, which states that at the core of peace education is respect for dignity of all persons. Peace education uses a human rights-based approach to ensure protection and inclusiveness. So you'll notice across all of these different policies that they highlight inclusion, equity, and respecting personal dignity. In line with that, I wanted to emphasize models of disabilities because these inform our decision-making. The reality is that everyone has their own personal biases, their own personal preferences, and their own personal ideologies. There's nothing wrong with this inherently, it's only human. but it's important to analyze where we fall within this continuum because our personal views inform the kind of decisions that we make, especially as it relates to inclusive education. So if you have never heard this term before, model of disability, what I mean by that are these are social constructs that are made by society. In other words, they're examples of how we as society understand the disabilities or the experience of having a disability. So predominantly in the literature, we find two dominant models, the medical model and the social model. However, this dichotomous view doesn't actually represent reality. But in short, it's a nice way to summarize the differences in these views. And the first is the medical model, which is the view that disability is something to be fixed. Historically, people with disabilities have been sent away to institutions. This is true in the United States, and it's still true in many places in the world. And that line of thinking it's not an inclusive mindset, but that is ultimately is rooted in the medical model through a strict medical model definition. The opposite of that, the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, would be the social model, which places disability as a construct made by society. So in other words, society creates disabling barriers, and if we just make everything accessible, then the concept of disability will no longer exist, so to speak. This is an extreme view of disability, and it ignores the need for medical intervention, which we know in reality is simply necessary for people with and without disabilities. So with that said, we can see here in the middle are many other examples of models that are some kind of combination between these two different viewpoints of disability. And so, for example, we have the charity model, cultural model, the identity model, and the human rights model. And ultimately, these are all different combinations of these two extreme views. And the reason why I bring this up today is because I want to ask you for you to reflect and just think on this. Where do you fall on this spectrum when you view other people, people of different disabilities or other forms of diversity or from other types of disadvantaged backgrounds? It is really important that we recognize.
Can I just,
Oh,
sorry, can I just pause quick? Can you please share your slides? We cannot see
oh,
them.
oh, I'm so.
Thank you.
Yep. No, thank you. On my end, it said that it was sharing the screen, so I apologize for that. Can you all see my slides now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for letting me know. And feel free to pause me at any time when needed. So just to summarize again, this is an example of a continuum of the different models of disabilities. And so most people fall somewhere in the middle, somewhere on this continuum. But we know that these international policies, and I'll go ahead and back the slide up just so you all can see what we were just discussing just a moment ago. These different key international policies related to transformative pedagogy and inclusive and equitable education, that position is informed from a more social model of disability. Not necessarily a strict social model, but just the idea of we need to take action to make sure that our educational settings and what we are offering in terms of education is coming from a place of inclusiveness and equity, and that is informed by a more social model approach to disability. In reality, our disability and our dispositions inform our pedagogical approaches. So when I say the term disposition, that is a person's inherent qualities of mind and character. Also, a disposition, another definition of the term disposition is an inclination or a tendency. So do we have an inclination towards inclusion? How inclusive are we of students with different cultural or ethnic backgrounds? How inclusive are we of students with disabilities? How inclusive are we of students who maybe are refugees? So these are all examples of ways that we can have a more inclusive and equitable disposition. So here on this slide, as an example, we have inclusive practices, social models of disability, and equity-based decision-making as key components that inform transformative pedagogy. And when we are implementing these different components, we can then use technology in such a way that is going to advanced transformative pedagogy in our settings. And so I also want to emphasize that these are not the only elements of transformative pedagogy. For example, social emotional learning is also a framework that is included as part of transformative pedagogy as well. These are just a few examples to consider. So thinking about transformative pedagogy and our own dispositions and our own inclinations towards being inclusive towards others of different forms of diversity, I wanted to take a few minutes to highlight Universal Design for Learning, which is a great example of a transformative framework. So for those who maybe have never heard of Universal Design for Learning before, it is based off of 3 principles, which is multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. This framework is quite comprehensive. It includes 9 guidelines and 31 checkpoints. But a key theme throughout this framework is that it ensures accessibility, and it is based on universal design for architecture. And another key feature is that, or something to highlight, is that the universal design for architecture is also informed by social models of disability. So again, we can see how someone's positionality, how their inclinations towards inclusion of those with different needs can inform a transformative framework or pedagogy. So this particular research study now that I would like to highlight. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the effectiveness of a UDL enhanced online module. So we're looking at educational technology here on the topic of functional behavior assessment, and the audience was pre-service teachers. So a quick overview of the methodology is that it was a randomized control trial using 2 groups with a pre-test and post-test measures. There were 79 undergraduate education majors from 3 different sections of the same course. And so you'll notice with the 79 students, this was a study that took place during COVID years. So statistically speaking, it was an underpowered study. Still, we had some pretty interesting results from this that we'll share in a few moments. And the environment of the study was an online university course. So here's a screenshot of the module, and there's a link to it within the resource document. But this is just a model for how UDL can be used in an online environment. And so the content of the material that was presented in the module was presented 4 different ways. It was presented on the actual web page. There was also the option to download the content in a Word document for students to read. They also had the option to download a PowerPoint presentation complete with images, audio, and speaker notes, or they could watch a video to learn the same content. The idea was not that they would, that one had to watch the video and do the PowerPoint and read the Word document. They all had the same exact content. The point was that the learner had the opportunity to choose their own learning and how they wanted to absorb the material and how they wanted to have that material presented to them. So thinking about that and how empowering conceptually that is for students, was it effective? What were the results of this study? So here are some descriptive statistic analysis from this study. There were 20 questions, so that explains the range of the answers here. And this study was completed again during COVID, so it was not statistically significant because of the sample size. However, you can see that the descriptive statistics indicate the intervention was in fact effective. Both the treatment and control group increased their knowledge of the content based on the pre and post assessments, which is what we want to see because it's a university course. We wanted all students to learn. However, you will notice that in the treatment group, across all descriptive statistics, students actually demonstrated higher levels of learning through this transformative framework. Most importantly, I really would like to highlight some of the qualitative feedback from this research study. And the first piece of feedback states, I really appreciate the module's implementation of UDL. As education students, we are always taught to apply UDL in the classroom, but we are never presented our course content within the UDL framework. Additionally, another student shared, I enjoyed the video and the Word doc because with me having ADHD, I love when things are read to me. I feel this is the best way I learn. These are university students. These are not K through 12 students. And yet, even as adult learners, they benefited from having this multiple means of representation through this technology environment, this virtual learning environment. What was really interesting is that I did not, excuse me, I did not have any students who were registered with the Student Accessibility Services at the university. So I had no idea that there was a student with ADHD. They did not self-disclose any form of disability. And the reason why I wanted to emphasize that is because we don't know how many people have different learning needs or disabilities that are within our classroom settings, whether that's K through, in America, K through 12 learning. In other countries, the grade system is different, but across whether it's grade school or whether it's higher education, we have many diverse student learners. And so it's so important to consider a variety of needs so that we can better design our instructional technology and our education interventions to meet those different needs. So seeing this Universal Design for Learning study, we know that UDL is a transformative framework, and it is informed by research, by neuroscience, the Universal Design principles for architecture, and aligns with social emotional learning. And again, we see all these different elements that informs this transformative pedagogy. So that was one example of a framework that can inform our instruction, our educational technology implementation. Now I'm going to move into the FAIR test, which provides us with some guiding questions that help promote equity. So here we have a resource from the National Center on Systemic Improvement, and that provides us with, quote, the FAIR test. And I really appreciate this resource because it provides us with some considerations to ensure that the choices that we are making in our education systems, and whether it's any sort of educational initiative, a new program, a new intervention, or educational technology, that we're approaching this through an equity lens. So what FAIR stands for is that it's feasible to implement, it is acceptable to families, students, and professionals, it is effective in producing a positive impact, and it is relevant for your identified context. So thinking about that and our research study that we just discussed, did that pass the FAIR test? In terms of feasibility, it was easily implemented within this online environment, and it was during COVID years, so it made sense from a feasibility perspective. Was it acceptable? Based on the feedback from the students, it was definitely acceptable. It was very highly appreciated from the students to have these multiple means of engagement and representation and expression. What was the impact? What is the evidence for the practice? We actually found that from the descriptive statistics that there was some evidence of impact. And was it relevant? Based on the fact that the students demonstrated knowledge gains on this topic, that it proved to be relevant for the students. So this is an example of using the FAIR test to guide some implementation. So putting it all together, we're going to move into other examples of technology and implementation. And some unique attributes of technology is that it gives learners various ways of acquiring information and knowledge. It provides learners with alternatives for demonstrating what they know and for rehearsing what they know. And it taps into learners' interests and offers appropriate challenges and increases motivation. You'll notice that these align with those 3 UDL principles as well. So we have a case example here of implementing an iPad. I'm just going to read this aloud and we'll walk through these different components of the FAIR test. A primary school has purchased 5 iPads per general education classroom. Teachers receive a 30-minute training on how to use the iPad but are not familiar with the language arts and mathematics apps. As a result, teachers are only using iPads as a reward at the end of the day. Furthermore, teachers in a separate special needs class did not receive any iPads due to funding constraints. Does this technology integration pass the FAIR test? In terms of feasibility, Is it possible to implement this practice with fidelity? Well, in this case, the teachers didn't receive the support to be able to implement this with fidelity. Is it acceptable? Well, there are some mixed results there as well, because not all of the teachers received the technology. In terms of impact, there's definitely plenty of research that supports the implementation of iPads across educational settings. However, without these other fair questions being addressed, there's minimal impact in this specific situation because teachers didn't have the training that they needed. The iPads instead were used just as something to at the end of the day. It wasn't used to help enhance the instruction. And what was the relevance? It didn't seem to be relevant. It was a missed opportunity in this example. So you can see here that you can have the best of intentions when purchasing some sort of educational technology. However, without having the necessary infrastructure in place, it may result in a missed opportunity for our students. And with schools having limited resources, we want to make sure that the resources and funding that are spent towards these educational technology initiatives are being used appropriately and effectively. Here we have another example with artificial intelligence. Prior to the start of the school year, science teachers at a secondary school expressed interest in using AI to help them be more efficient when developing lesson plans. The school administrator allocated funds towards purchasing an AI program for professional learning on how to use AI for lesson planning. The administrator also allocated time for a school-based professional learning community so teachers can collaborate on ideas for using AI for lesson planning. After the first grading period, the administrator intends to seek feedback regarding the usefulness of AI and whether to continue pursuing this initiative with the remaining teachers. So thinking about the FAIR test, is it feasible? Well, in this case, the administrator was sure to include some support for the teachers by providing some professional development and professional learning so that educators could know how to use this for the intended purpose. In terms of acceptability, we find that it was actually the stakeholders who initiated the request, so it was very acceptable. In terms of impact, the administrator is monitoring for feedback to address the impact. While currently there is emerging research on the use of AI, we don't necessarily have a whole lot of research right now to determine the impact of AI for this specific use. And hence that is why the administrator is monitoring for the impact at a school-based level and receiving feedback from teachers to further guide their decision making. And is it relevant? So does this practice program or intervention meet the specific needs of the students? Well, in this case, there's plenty of support through the professional learning community, through the professional development opportunities to ensure that teachers are able to use this platform to meet the needs of those students. So I would say that in this example, we have a pass regarding the FAIR test. So now that we have discussed our inclusive dispositions and some international policies that inform our inclusive dispositions and move us forward to transformative pedagogy, and we have reviewed an example of transformative pedagogy through Universal Design for Learning, and we have received some guidance using the FAIR test. I wanted to share with you some additional resources and thoughts to consider regarding technology implementation. So some additional resources are provided through this link. You can use either this link or scan the QR code with your phone, but please know that this will be formally provided through the event organizers. And I just wanted to touch base briefly. We've just went in detail about the Universal Design for Learning framework, but there are some other frameworks that you can use as well to help guide your implementation of educational technology. The first is backwards design, and there are essentially 3 different steps or questions that are addressed with backwards design. The first is, what is the intended end of the learning process? So it is so important that we start with what is our intended outcome for our students. So before we adopt a new initiative, we want to make sure that it's going to be relevant for our students. So to go back to that iPad example, we want to make sure that when we adopt this, that we are doing it with purpose so that it is going to address their specific learning needs. The second question is, how do I check what they have learned? That is something else to consider in planning when you adopt new technology. And finally, which learning activities will lead students to the desired results? The next framework is multi-tiered system of supports. You may have heard of this or have seen a version of this implemented. It is used commonly throughout the United States, but also other countries use some form of a tiered system of supports. This framework is comprehensive and it is meant to address the needs of struggling students. In context of technology implementation, much like the iPad example, we want to make sure that we are using educational technology to support Tier 1 instruction. In other words, educational technology should support core instruction and be available to all students. So those are just some considerations if you are in a school system that is utilizing some sort of tiered support. And further information about these particular frameworks, as well as all of the other topics discussed during today's session, are provided. And with that said, I want to leave you with my contact information. Thank you all so much for attending this session. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'd be happy to walk you through in further detail about any of these topics, especially as it relates to inclusive education and special needs education.
Thank you so much. That was a really insightful presentation. Please join us for our next presentation. It's going to be it's going to be Rise to the Purpose-Led Generation, a Transformative Response, which will have a 15-minute break, and you can join us there. Thank you.
Thank you.